Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour Podcast. This is part of our ongoing special series on the REINS Act, the REINS Act in Focus. Very excited to bring on our guest. I love this organization, have been a fan for quite some time. They are now, I'm going to say it, Joe, a storied organization, the Pacific Legal Foundation. His name is Joe Esposito. He is the federal policy chief for PLF. And at some point, we'll have a long-form interview to talk. Did I get that right? We'll have a long-form interview to talk about all the great things that PLF is doing. But let's start to talk about the REINS Act. Listen, if there's any organization that is closely tied to the important changes, the reining in of executive branch power by the Supreme Court, it's the Pacific Legal Foundation and the work that you guys do. Talk about how the REINS Act plays into your ongoing legal work as an organization.
No, thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks for having me.
Always.
You're right. One of the biggest things that we do is obviously suing the government, and that's a big way that we break down what they do when it comes to the separation of powers and the overreach of government. But the other piece is doing some of this legislative work that my team works on in particular. And the REINS Act has been one that we've been looking at for a very long time. Because the essential idea behind the REINS Act, as you well know, is to really take back some of that power that Congress has granted to the executive agencies and really, as the name suggests, rein it in a little bit and make sure they go through Congress before these major changes are made.
Well, it gets into two things that I think are of import, right? If there was a little bit greater accountability on the part of these rules that they didn't go off and do things that Congress never intended, then you guys wouldn't necessarily need to be suing the government as much as you do. And also there's the issue of the politicization of the high court. We talked a little bit about this with Ilya Shapiro the other day. Touch on both of those things, given your clientele and given the kinds of cases that you're bringing and how that plays into the expansive interpretation of the administrative state.
Right. And, that shows up in a lot of different forms. Actually, when I first encountered this, I was with another group and we were looking at the criminal law and how that affected what happened with these regulations as well. Right. So it ranges from sort of the smaller items to the much larger items that could wind up putting you in prison. So for some of our clients, some of these issues might involve things like government overreach when it comes to how a certain agency operates, when it comes to how they prosecute crimes against them or how they prosecute other violations against them. And because they've taken such an expansive interpretation of the law, that really affects their livelihood. Instead, what should be happening when Congress sees these things happening, they often can pass the buck saying, look, this is a power we delegated, perhaps improperly, but that's another issue for another day. But if they improperly delegated that power, that's something that they should be able to take back. But this is one way they can effectively do it without having to make major changes to the statutes, but simply saying if there's a major change in law by these regulations that has a major effect on the economy, major effect on the American public, it just has to go through Congress once again. And that'll really make sure that they're all on the same page when these major changes go into effect.
And it's one of those things where the examination of the costs of the regulation is really an expression or a function of the size and scope of those regulations, right? How deeply they burrow into society. And when you have all of these administrative agencies that are cloaked in such enormous power, our colleagues at the Competitive Enterprise Institute have done a series of studies on the bias and the inherent conflicts of interest and in the administrative proceedings, not the Administrative Procedures Act, but when enforcement actions are taken, and talk about that imbalance, and again how the REINS Act plays into all this or can play into all of this.
Well, it can certainly play into it. This is another part of our project that we have. It's the agency adjudication, where these agency adjudicators are not real judges, but instead they're taking these actions as if they are judges, and these things just get simply appealed, like you said, showing the bias within the agency. With the REINS Act, because you're going to have a lot of these regulations that people could be violating coming up before Congress, that's likely, again, no guarantees here,
right,
but likely going to cut back on those types of prosecutions and adjudications. Prosecutions isn't even really the right word. They feel like them, but they're not.
Right.
They're just agency adjudications. And those are the things that will be presumably cut back, because if you have fewer regulations for them to deal with, you're just not going to see those coming up in these adjudications.
For you guys, I mean, obviously, we can talk about the issue of sensible regulations, but I suspect, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, from the Pacific Legal Foundation's perspective, this really is about accountability and greater accountability for these agencies, isn't it?
Absolutely right. They are getting divorced from the American public, right? You have obviously Congress, and as bad as their ratings might be, right, on both sides of the aisle when it comes to what the public thinks of them, in the end, in the House, you have every 2 years, and your senator is every 6 years. You have a chance to actually say that you disagree with what they're up to and what they're doing. The public have a voice. So, to some degree, the executive branch has that because you have the presidency. But as we know, and as President Trump talks about quite often, there's a lot of people that are very much embedded in the civil service that are not really following what's happening, even from the executive, or forget about the Congress, certainly not from even their boss, essentially. They don't want to have to follow that. And we've seen a number of lawsuits going on already. So, because of that problem, they get divorced from that accountability that they would normally have if they were really truly a member of the political branches. By bringing this back to Congress, you're saying, look, the people who are directly elected by the to review and see if these things are actually worthwhile to move forward.
And this gets into my other question, which is, obviously a lot of Republicans are in support of the REINS Act, and I know PLF is a nonpartisan organization. I do my own work for a 501c3 organization, so I'm similarly in that boat. But obviously on the political front, these things have to appeal and should appeal to folks on the Democratic side of the aisle. And this issue of accountability and the impact on criminal justice, it seems to me this should be of great appeal to folks who are on that side of the aisle. Talk about that. Talk about people who ought to be inherently skeptical of concentrated power in the federal executive branch.
You're absolutely right. A lot of these issues we do see as nonpartisan, right? We have this issue, we have issues regarding the appointments clause, that this actually has to be somebody who's presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed in order to pass one of these rules in the first place.
Mm,
So again, these are the type of things that you would think would be obvious to both sides of the aisle. But instead, we had a funny situation in particular when it comes to the appointments clause, where you had Jerry Nadler of the Democrats last time around when the Democratic Accountability and Rulemaking bill passed the House, arguing that, well, if President Trump were to become president, and this was a couple of years ago, if he were to become president, he might not be able to get people through the Senate because he'll pick all these radicals. They won't get approved, and then we won't have any rulemaking. Well, that's exactly what he would want,
right.
presumably. But of course, because, and getting back to the REINS Act, if the people writing these rules and moving forward with these rules are essentially independent of the president and they can act without really his consent, without really a good overview from him or the Congress, you need some way to check this power. And the REINS Act is a really good way to do that.
So let's talk about what's been happening. I mean, you've got a constitutional background. Obviously, you're working on these federal public policy issues and what's going on up in Congress. So as we are recording this, the Senate parliamentarian has ruled that this can't be included as part of the reconciliation package. Want to get your perspective on that, whether or not it should meet the Byrd rule, and how far should the Republicans go in pushing past the ruling of the parliamentarian?
I think in this case, I think it really should have qualified. There's a few things in there that made sense that got knocked out. This is one I just don't think it did. The way they did the REINS Act this time around was to really make sure that it did affect revenue, saying that these are only types of things that would either incur penalties or fines that would actually then raise revenue for the government, which then is putting in a budgetary impact and part of what they're factoring into a number of these things. So to me, that's very unfortunate. I think generally speaking, maybe I'm too traditionalist when it comes to these things, but I think the parliamentarians' rulings, they're generally fair. I don't necessarily agree with them every time, but they're generally pretty good. In other questions where the parliamentarian questioned things along the Congressional Review Act, I think that was a different matter because I think that is within the prerogative of, and that's a different issue altogether, right? But on this one, it seems like a good one to follow. And instead, I'd really go back to your last question, saying that, look, this is something that should be bipartisan,
Right.
and that it should be worthy of getting 60 votes. And particularly, I would urge folks on the left side of the aisle to say, now is the time you certainly want to do it when your president is not the one who's in there. So
Right.
this is the best time, if ever, that the other side of the aisle should recognize this as an issue as well.
Listen, because I haven't had somebody from PLF in for an interview on this session. Did you guys have a case this term around? Did you add to your exemplary record, or is this a bye year for PLF?
it was a bye year for us, unfortunately. Although we did actually have, and I'm going to forget what it was, but Justice Gorsuch in his dissent did cite one of our amicus briefs. So we felt pretty good about that. We got a little inclusion in there as well. But no, unfortunately, no cases this time around. But we are hopeful. We're looking for a few others that we've put forward for the next term. We're still waiting to hear back on.
Actually, before I let you go, because, again, one of the things I was talking with Ilya Shapiro is this issue of the politicization of the high court, and wanted to get your perspective on this. I mean, if Congress is stepping in to make these decisions, that some of which, I don't know why the Loper Bright decision was so unpopular, but it was unpopular on the other side of the aisle. But this gets to this issue: if they have fewer of these fundamental decisions to make, they won't be so politicized. Your thoughts on this?
Right. It puts them in a very difficult position just because of some things that past courts have done. Like you said, with Loper Bright, they had a reverse Chevron. That was a mistake of 40 some odd years ago. That was something they had to reverse. So the court ends up looking political in a lot of instances. But ironically, again, like even in the transgender minors case that just came up in the past couple of weeks, this is something where they said, look, this is not our decision to make. This is actually for the political branches. Let's pass this back down to them in the same way they did with Dobbs. So the politicization is sort of an interesting question because I think the courts actually made an effort to say that if these are questions of policy, we are not going to touch them in so much as that we're not going to give them some sort of special protection here at the court level where it's just not appropriate. So ironically, they wind up looking political, although what they're actually doing is making themselves less political.
Well, listen, I appreciate this. I so appreciate the work that you guys are doing. As I'm fond of saying, if I'd ever gone and gotten my JD after I was the reader for a blind lawyer for 3 years, property rights, constitutional, regulatory issues. If I had been able to stick it out, sit for the bar, or get my JD, doing the work that you guys are doing at PLF and the work that some of the other nonprofit legal foundations, public interest legal foundations are doing, that's the worthwhile work in this world. So thank you all very much. How do folks find out more about the good work you guys are doing?
Just go over to pacificlegal.org, and if you go over to our legislation page, you can see what we're working on with our federal agenda in particular, and you can see all the legislation that we have going on at the state and federal level.
Pacificlegal.org is the website. Our guest has been Joe Lupino Esposito. I think I got it reversed at the beginning, Joe, and I apologize for that. He is the federal policy chief for PLF. Go and check them out. This has been yet another in our series of special episodes regarding the REINS Act, the REINS Act in Focus from the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour. I'm Andrew Langer. I'm your host. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.